What I want to do in this session is to look at the question of how to go about choosing a Bible that's right for you. That might sound like an odd kind of question, but the reality is these days there are actually many different versions and translations of the Bible. Each of them has its own specific characteristics, which means some versions of the Bible are more suitable for particular groups and particular individuals. So part of what we're going to be exploring in this session of the Dean's Forum series is how to go about choosing the Bible which is right for you. Firstly, let's think about how we got the Bible that we have. And in doing that, and particularly if this was a live session with a group of people actually in the audience, which of course we can't do during the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions, we'd be thinking about which versions or translations of the Bible people in the group typically use. What is the Bible we already have? Why do we use that version? To what extent are we comfortable with it? And to what extent are we conscious of some limitations with a particular version, translation, or even edition that we happen to have? So we talk about that, and you might want to give that some thought just as you watch this particular video. What are the characteristic features of Bibles which we typically enjoy using? It might be the feel of the paper, it might be the way it's bound, it might be all the extra information that's found between the front cover and the back cover, but which is not actually part of the Bible as such. It may be the typeface, it might be the way the words are set out on the page. There are any number of things which will influence why we choose to use one particular edition of the Bible, irrespective of the version or the translation, rather than another. As I've already mentioned, many Bibles come with more than just the Bible. What you might find as a pew Bible in your local church is a pretty basic edition of the Bible with more or less just the text of the scriptures. But most of us have Bibles that include a number of other handy tools and aids to help us in our using of the scriptures. And that extra information can make a difference with how we use the scriptures, but of course they can also provide a framework or a lens through which we encounter the scriptures, and they can lead us to read the Bible in a particular way and to ignore other ways of possibly hearing and making sense of the sacred scriptures. So think about the Bible that you normally would go to yourself, why you like to use it, how you came to have that version, and any particular features about it which you like or find a bit troubling. We're going to focus obviously on the Bible in English today because that's the Bible most of us are going to be using. And we're now almost, not quite, but almost 10 years after the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, which is, if you like, the archetypal English translation of the Bible. And we'll perhaps talk a little bit more about that as we go along. The King James Bible, or more correctly, the authorized version of the Bible, was itself the culmination of a struggle within the British Church which had gone on for more than 100 years. And there were a number of translations of the Bible into English, some of them official, some of them unofficial, some of them suppressed by the religious authorities of the day. And this was part of the struggle around the Reformation. And one of the critical principles of the Reformation was that the Bible should be available in the common tongue, in other words, in the ordinary languages which people actually spoke. Now, as we translate that principle into our context, it also means the Bible has to be available in the common media, These days that means we need digital versions of the scriptures. But to read the Bible in a digital format is actually to encounter the scriptures in a very different way. So let's think a bit more about the Bible in English. Back then, at the time of the King James Bible being released, having a Bible in English was itself controversial. And some of the original translators were actually killed by the church and state authorities because of their involvement in this project. For them, the printed book was new technology. Printing press had not been around all that long, and the move to mass-produced printed books, which were cheap and easily disseminated, was a major change and one of the drivers, in fact, of the Reformation. Bibles were still expensive. In fact, they were so expensive they were sometimes chained to the lectern in the churches so that people could come into the church and see a Bible. Perhaps they could find somebody in the village who could read, who would read the Bible to them, but the Bibles were so precious they were chained to the lectern. This reminds me a little bit of being a child in Lismore in the 1950s, going down to the main shopping block of the city square to actually look through a window and see a television screen. And there were multiple people, family groups, lined up on the footpath looking through the window. They couldn't afford a television at home, but they would go down to the electrical store and look at this new thing through the window. In those days, very few people were literate. And in fact, the word clergy comes from clerics, and reflects the fact that often the priest was the only person in the village who could read and write. That's back then, 400 and something years ago. Today it's a bit different. We're moving into a world which is post-book. Some of us still enjoy holding a physical book in our hand and turning the pages, but many of our children and grandchildren simply don't experience literature that way. So we need a multimedia digital Bible, and indeed they're available. And these days we want them on our smartphones, we want them on our tablets, we want to be able to access these texts across multiple devices. And of course, as I mentioned, once we start to engage with the scriptures in that digital mode, it actually will impact on the way in which we read the scriptures. It's as simple as, with the printed Bible, you might look up a particular paragraph or even a specific verse, but your eye still sees what else is on the page. What's just before your target text? What is it that comes afterwards? With the digital text, you're more likely to go directly and exclusively to the passage that you're asking about, and you may never see what comes before, what comes after, what's the literary context of that particular text or verse or paragraph that you've been looking up. So most of us in our kind of culture will of course engage with the Bible in English, and that actually seems pretty unremarkable to us. I mean, how else would it be? It's what we're used to. It's normal, right? Not quite. Not normal at all. The Torah in the Jewish synagogue is still read in Hebrew. The Quran is recited in Arabic, both at the mosque and also in Islamic prayers and devotions. Within the Greek Orthodox churches, the Bible is still read in the Greek version that was around in the time of St. Paul. And of course, in Western Europe, for more than 1,000 years, from Jerome around about 400 AD, right through until the time of the Reformation and a little bit beyond, the dominant and almost the exclusive version of the Bible was in Latin, the so-called Latin Vulgate. So to read the Bible in English is a relatively new phenomenon, even though it's something that, of course, we're very used to. So let me ask this simple question. What is the world's oldest Bible? Sometimes we ask that in a joking way. What is the version which St. Paul used? And the answer is the King James. But of course we realise that's just a joke, and the King James Bible was not around in the time of St. Paul. So what is the world's oldest Bible? The answer is probably this document, Codex Sinaiticus, the Sinai Codex, or if you like, the Sinai volume of the Bible. And these days, as we would expect, apart from existing in an ancient 4th century manuscript, the simplest way for most of us to engage with the world's oldest Bible is through a website, Codex Sinaiticus. Do a search. It's actually a really interesting site to check out. And what we have in the Codex Sinaiticus is a book which has survived from the 4th century Roman Empire down until our own time. This is one of those rare artifacts that you could say somebody held this book in their hand sometime during the 4th century, when the Roman Empire was in many ways at its peak, when people like Constantine and his successors were the emperors of Rome, and the Roman Empire was in the process of becoming Christian. This book comes from back then. So it's an incredibly significant cultural artifact, quite apart from its religious significance, as possibly the oldest surviving copy of the Bible, and certainly the oldest copy of the complete New Testament as we know it today. Codex Sinaiticus. It looks something like this. You can see the larger page in the background. The text is divided into columns because at the time that the Codex was being invented, the paradigm was still the scroll, and scrolls were written in narrow columns, roughly the width of an adult male's leg, because that was your portable writing and reading desk. You can see from the close-up, and this is the first paragraph or so of the Gospel of Mark, you can see that this has been written by a well-trained scribe. The hand is very even. The characters are beautifully formed. It's of course all in Greek. There are no gaps between the words. The text is all in capitals, and there's no punctuation. But as you scroll down the page, even a little excerpt which is highlighted there on the screen, you can see that already in the 4th century, this copy of the Bible has been broken up into paragraphs to make it easier to read them in the liturgy of the church. And that's a fundamental insight about how we got the Bible. We got the Bible because people were reading it in church and in monasteries and in convents throughout Europe and beyond. So what do we have prior to a volume, a codex like Sinaiticus? Well, at least for the so-called Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures, all we have in ancient times are, of course, handwritten manuscripts. Every copy of the Bible prior to the invention of the printing press was a handwritten document, a manuscript. And that word, of course, reminds us that the script is done manually, is done by hand. Now, there's a story here. Not only were these texts handwritten, but they were mostly on scrolls, because in the Jewish tradition, a biblical text is best represented on a large, if you like, liturgical scroll. which can be processed into the synagogue, venerated and read from with great ceremony. Until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls from 1948 onwards, we had no surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible earlier than about 950 of the Common Era. And there's a very simple reason for that. Because Christians in the Byzantine world and in the medieval world and at the time of the Reformation destroyed any copies of the Hebrew Bible which they could get their hands on. So it's a sad and shameful part of our story. The oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible prior to 1948 were the Aleppo Codex, produced in Tiberias by the Sea of Galilee sometime in the 900s, when Palestine was, of course, part of the Islamic Empire. And then there's a slightly more complete version called the Leningrad Codex, which dates from just after 1000 of the Common Era. So apart from those two documents, until very recently, we had no copies of the Hebrew Bible, of the Jewish scriptures. Then there's the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This takes us back to the biblical period itself. This takes us back to the time of Jesus and the 100 years or so prior to the time of Jesus. The first of the scrolls came to light in 1948, and that's a whole incredible story which we won't try and cover today. But the discovery of these 1,000 or so manuscripts, which we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, which included about 250 biblical documents, took our knowledge of the Bible and our examples, extant surviving examples of the Bible, back by 1,000 years, from roughly 950 to 1,000 Common Era, back to about 150 BCE. There are some 200, more than 200 of the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually copies of a portion of the Old Testament. Obviously, there are no copies of the New Testament among the Dead Sea Scrolls. In some cases, we obviously have multiple copies of the same books, because there's only 22 or 39 books in the Old Testament, depending how you count them. So if we have more than 200 biblical texts, that tells us we have multiple copies, particularly of books like Isaiah, Deuteronomy, the Psalms, and so on. The only book from the Jewish scriptures or the Christian Old Testament which was not found at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, was the book of Esther. And that's probably because Esther had married a pagan ruler, and the Feast of Purim, for which the book of Esther is the sacred text, may not have been a festival which the custodians of what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls recognized. So what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is like drawing back the curtains and seeing what the Bible looked like before it was finalized. And in particular, for example, we can actually see how the book of Psalms is coming together with a slightly different configuration than the one we're familiar with. These discoveries have allowed us to correct and improve our versions of the Bible. There are paragraphs and other phrases here and there which had either been lost or corrupted or were not able to be correctly interpreted until we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that, of course, raises an interesting problem. If a paragraph has never been in the Bible at any point up until 1950, and then we discover scrolls from 2,000 years ago, which are biblical texts, but predate the finalization of the scriptures, but they have the missing texts, which our Bibles are lacking, do we put those new old words into our Bible, or do we leave them out? And that's an issue which modern Bible publishers deal with in very different ways. So let's keep going. We not only have the Hebrew manuscripts, we not only have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we also have the Greek New Testament documents, mostly initially papyrus and then later on codex or codices in the plural. In fact, there are about 10,000 different documents which give us the text of the New Testament in Greek and also the Old Testament translations in Greek. About half of them are lectionaries. In other words, copies of portions of the Bible, like the Psalms, all the Gospels, all the epistles, which have been prepared so that those passages can be read in the liturgy. And that, again, gives us a clue as to how we got the Bible and why the Bible was preserved. None of them are from the 1st century, or earlier, of course. A handful come from the 2nd century of the Common Era, mostly fragments. It's more common to find some Greek biblical manuscripts beginning to occur from the 3rd century onwards, particularly in the 200s, 250, things like that. And then, of course, we have the major codices from the 4th century and the 5th century, which include Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus. These are the major ancient examples of the Bible in Greek, including both Old Testament and the Deuterocanonical texts, as well as the New Testament. So we come down to the Textus Receptus. There's a typo there. It should be Textus Receptus. I think autocorrect had its way with my computer page. These are the texts of the Bible, particularly in Hebrew and Greek, as they existed in Western Europe, particularly northwestern Europe, at the time of the Reformation. Now we're at the beginning of what we call textual criticism. As scholars became aware of the variations between different ancient manuscripts and even different contemporary manuscripts that came from different monasteries and different cathedrals, and began the process of trying to iron out those differences and determine the agreed received text, as it were, on the basis of which they would do their translations into English, into German, into French, into Dutch, and so on. The difficulty with the Textus Receptus is that at the time of the Reformation, these scholars, Erasmus and others, had no access to ancient texts such as Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Alexandrinus. They simply did not have access to these ancient documents, which were living either in the vault at the Vatican Library, or in the case of Sinaiticus, in the library at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai in the Egyptian desert. It was only because of the impact of European imperialism throughout the Middle East in the 19th century that Russian and German and English and French scholars came across these ancient examples of the Bible, which predated the Textus Receptus by many, many centuries and often had significant variations or differences from the received text on which versions like the King James Bible were based. This was followed up by archaeological discoveries, including the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Nag Hammadi manuscripts and the Cairo Geniza, and of course then a flurry of research into those dusty old volumes in the back corners of monastic libraries in Greece and throughout the Middle East. So that brings us down to the basis of a Bible translation today and to the work of the United Bible Societies internationally. And they've created what's called an eclectic, critical text for both the Old Testament and the New Testament. In other words, we no longer choose one ancient manuscript and translate it, but we try to get the information and the evidence from multiple ancient manuscripts and try to determine by the application of critical principles what the original version, the original text may have been like. These critical editions include the deuterocanonical texts, which you'll find in the Old Testament Apocrypha. They're eclectic, as I just said. They gathered together the evidence from multiple ancient witnesses. They work with the principles of textual criticism, which we won't go into today, but they include things like, if you have two texts and one of them has something awkward about it, and the other one no longer has that awkward dimension to it, probably the awkward text is more original and the smooth text is probably a later stage of the textual process. These modern, eclectic, critical texts of the Hebrew Bible and of the Greek Septuagint and so on, and of the Greek New Testament are the basis for all contemporary critical scholarship of the scriptures, and they're also the basis for all modern translations of the Bible. But that, of course, excludes versions such as the King James Bible or the Authorized Version, which does not in any way draw upon this scientific information. So let's think for a moment about the family tree of our familiar Old English Bible. And we'll just focus on 3 or 4 branches of the family. The dominant branch is what we call the Authorized Version. Some people call it the King James Bible, which was published in 1611 under the authority of King James and was authorized for use in the Church of England, hence its 2 names, the Authorized Version or the King James Bible. It was updated most particularly in 1881 with the Revised Version as they began to take account of some of the new discoveries from the Middle East. It was further updated in 1952 with the publication of the Revised Standard Version, which made so many changes on the basis of the evidence from the 2nd, 3rd and 4th and 5th centuries that some evangelical and conservative Christians decided the RSV was an evil document that was trying to undermine our faith, when in fact it was trying to give us a more accurate version of the scriptures. That was further updated in 1989 with the new Revised Standard Version, the NRSV, which is the standard academic version of the Bible in English used in theological colleges and seminaries and universities right around the world, regardless of the denominational identity of the institution. And that was further published in a simplified version as the English Standard Version, the ESV, as recently as 2001. So that's one dominant kind of family of English Bibles. Slightly different tradition is the Jerusalem Bible from 1966 and the New Jerusalem Bible from 1985, not 1885 as on the screen. And that's a Roman Catholic Bible, mostly translating a French translation, which itself drew on the ancient Greek, Hebrew and Latin evidence. But the Jerusalem Bible at the time took a totally different approach to Bible translation and had a huge impact on the English-speaking biblical market. Then there's the New International Version, which first came out in 1978 and has had a couple of editions tweaking it more recently. And we'll talk about the NIV later on. It's perhaps the most popular version amongst evangelicals, although some ultra-conservative people still prefer the King James Version, hence the joke that it was good enough for Paul, it's good enough for us. Finally, I just want to mention the contemporary English version from 1985. This is the Bible version, particularly promoted by the Bible Society in Australia, in the UK and other countries. We perhaps first came across it as the Good News Bible, Good News for Today, the contemporary English version, it was sometimes called, today's English version. Then it came out as the Good News Bible. Now it's been reissued and updated as the CEV, the contemporary English version. It's a relatively easy to understand translation, auspiced by the Bible Societies, and it does also include the apocryphal texts. For the Old Testament Apocrypha, the Deuterocanonical texts, which of course you can get in the Authorized family. You can get it, of course, in the Jerusalem Bible, because it's a Roman Catholic edition. You will not get an edition of the NIV, which includes the Deuterocanonical texts of the Old Testament Apocrypha, even though they are part of the Anglican Bible. So let's have a look at it just very briefly. Don't let this screen hurt your eyes too much. It's simply showing us graphically that at the current time, as you can see by the right-hand end of that bar, there's been a vast increase in the number and the diversity of Bible translations available in English. For several hundred years, there was one English Bible. In the last several decades, we have seen dozens of editions of the Bible, hence the need for a session like this to talk about how we choose a Bible that's right for us. Another way of looking at it is this kind of chart. You can find many examples of these charts on the internet and in some study editions of the Bible. And it's just demonstrating the diversity, but also the family groupings of the major English versions of the Bible. The bigger question here is not this version versus that version, but rather the kind of Bible translation you're looking for. Some Bibles, some translations, some versions of the Bible are more towards the left-hand end of the spectrum, and they focus on an almost literal word-for-word translation from the Hebrew or the Greek into English. And that was certainly true of the Authorized Version or the King James. It doesn't actually make for good English, but it does mean that the English text represents quite strongly the underlying Hebrew and Greek form of the Bible. At the other end of the spectrum, there are versions and translations of the Bible which are more like a paraphrase, and the most famous example these days is The Message by Eugene Peters, which says, let's not worry about word for word, let's kind of think about what they're trying to say in that paragraph, and let's choose our own words to say the same thing, to get the same message across. And that's why a paraphrase Bible, like The Message, can be quite refreshing, because the meaning of the Bible might be coming across much more clearly. Of course, we may also just be listening to the opinion of the translator rather than attending to the underlying message of the Hebrew and Greek texts. And then in the middle, as always, there's another group of Bible versions which try to go somewhere in between. They realize that a word-for-word translation doesn't work very well in English, but they want to stay as close to the original Greek and Hebrew as they can. So they tend to go thought for thought rather than word for word, and they will avoid paraphrasing, and they'll stick fairly closely to the original underlying Hebrew and Greek texts. So when you're thinking about a Bible, choosing a Bible, one of the things to weigh up is to what extent do you want your English Bible to reflect pretty closely what's in the Greek and the Hebrew? To what extent do you want to have a really engaging paraphrase? And to what extent do you want to follow the big ideas thought for thought rather than word for word? So let's walk through some of the options that you have. Firstly, there's what we call a study Bible. And a study Bible is more than just a Bible. It includes the scriptures, but it will include a whole lot of additional information. There may be explanatory notes. There may be extensive footnotes at the bottom of the page. There may be other essays at the beginning and the end of the volume. And at the back there will be tables and appendices and maps and charts and so on. An early example of this was the famous Thompson Chain Reference Bible, which provided a set of references, cross-references, so that as you read down the page, it would alert you to other parts of the Bible where similar ideas or similar phrases were used. That's one way of engaging with Scripture, but it's very focused on the literal words rather than the meaning of the words. Then there's something like the Oxford Annotated Study Bible, and that's the one illustrated in that red image. This is the standard version of the Bible that you'll find being used in seminaries and universities and colleges around the world. There's also the New Interpreter's Study Bible, which is based on the New Interpreter's Bible, which is a 12-volume set of Bible translations and commentaries. There's the Jewish Study Bible. I have one of those right here, which is looking at particularly at the Old Testament and giving a Jewish translation and providing notes which come from a Jewish theological perspective. And then there's the Jewish New Testament, and I have one of those on the shelf behind me as well, which is a translation of the New Testament done by Jewish scholars, not by Christians. Again, you see how it was going to provide a different kind of perspective on the biblical text. And there's a huge array of study Bibles, including NIV study Bibles and so on. Then there are other tools building, if you like, a Bible study toolkit. And one example of that is what we call a Bible dictionary. And in this sense, dictionary really means encyclopedia, as you can see. I mean, the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible is 5 volumes long. It's not just a little book explaining what different words means. It's a whole set of really interesting theological, historical, and cultural essays arranged alphabetically. So here is a case of choosing your tribe. What kind of a Christian are you? What kind of part of the church do you belong to? Are you Catholic? Are you Anglican? Are you evangelical? Are you very conservative? Are you more progressive? And so you collect a set of tools which will reflect your particular perspective, your particular interests. So choosing your tribe, selecting the scholars whose voice you want to hear, and then deciding whether to go print or digital, because most of these resources are not only available in print form, but these days you can also get them as part of a Bible software program. And the two major options you have there are Logos and Accordance. They're both available for Mac and PC. And some people prefer Accordance, as I do. Other people prefer Logos. Some prefer Olive Tree. But the two major options are Accordance Bible software and Logos Bible software. Then it's important to develop the skill of reading between the lines. And I've quoted a little part of a verse from Mark 13. Let the reader understand. There's a kind of a code which is used by religious publishers. And so you need to, it's helpful at least, if you become familiar with the code, and that helps you to avoid buying a book you really don't want to have because it's not suitable to your interests and your perspective. And it also helps you to go looking for the resources and for the publishers and for the authors whose voice you do want to pay attention to. So one set of publishers is what I'm calling academic publishers. These tend to be people who will publish biblical and theological scholarship, and they're not interested in the faith affiliation of the author. They might be Jewish, they might be Catholic, they might be Protestant, they might be Anglican, they might be Orthodox. The publisher doesn't care. They're just interested in the quality of the scholarship. And so the Anchor Bible, which is now called the Anchor Yale Bible, is a whole library of resources. Cambridge University Press, of course, publish academic material. Harper, sometimes called HarperCollins, publishes material of this kind. Oxford, as we've already seen, Oxford University published series like the Oxford or the New Oxford Annotated Study Bible. And I've already referenced the New Interpreter's Bible, which is, as I said, it's about a 12-volume hardcover commentary set on the whole Bible. These are what I would describe as academic publishers. They don't push a particular theological or religious point of view, but they draw on and they contribute to critical scholarship related to the scriptures. Then there's evangelical or conservative publishers, and there's a little bit of overlap, but basically these publishers have their eye on a particular audience. They're not really trying to engage the scholars, but they are trying to sell books, and lots of them, to a more conservative and a more evangelical readership. And the leading brand here is anything with the words international or particularly new international in the title. As with the NIV, the New International Version, if you see a Bible dictionary or a commentary, an encyclopedia that has New International Dictionary of, okay, then you know it's written by and for evangelical people. And so it's a kind of it's a little certificate to the potential purchaser saying, if you're looking for sound evangelical theology, this is the book for you. Because if you're not looking for that kind of theology, that's the kind of book to avoid. Other publishers from this kind of tradition include Baker Press, Eastman, Holman, Tyndale, and Zondervan, but there are many others besides. And then is what we would perhaps call denominational or even interfaith publishers. In other words, publishers that have a more theological agenda about them. So a Jewish commentary series or a Jewish translation of the Bible is not going to engage with Christian theological issues. It's going to engage with Jewish theological and liturgical dynamics. You might have commentaries and dictionaries that are written particularly for Lutherans or for Catholics and so on. You'll sometimes find resources that are prepared specifically for Orthodox, whether that's Russian Orthodox or Greek Orthodox and so on. And you'll also find material which is published for a more sort of progressive and even interfaith or sometimes New Age kind of audience. So being aware of the kind of differences between one set of publishers and another can be really helpful as you cruise the shelves in the bookshop or as you're searching online at Amazon. Then there's the question, with all that information, which is the version that's right for me? And frankly, the version that's right for me as a biblical scholar and a professional religious minister is probably not going to be the version that's right for many of the people in my congregation. I want to be able to get back into the Hebrew and the Greek text as quickly as possible. But certainly, I think for everybody, one of the issues is accuracy. Is this version, is this translation based on the best critical manuscript evidence? And that means, for example, that the King James Version and the New King James Bible just do not cut the mustard. They pay no attention at all to anything other than the textus receptus. Then, as I've already hinted, there's the theological perspective of the publisher and of the editorial team who have been working on the translation and providing the other material in the case of a study Bible. Am I able to work with their theological perspective? There are some versions of the Bible I will never use, including particularly the NIV, the so-called New International Version. Its translation is predicated on only promoting translations which support particular theological viewpoints. And that means the Bible has become subservient to the theology of the church rather than the other way around. Then there's the question of, am I buying this to read in church or to use at school, or am I buying this version of the Bible for my own personal use? So, for example, I particularly enjoy reading the New Jerusalem version of the Bible, but I would rarely use that to read out in church or in a classroom situation. For that, I'm more likely to use either the New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, or the Contemporary English Version, CEV. Related to that is the question, am I buying this because I want to do in-depth study of the biblical text, or am I looking for a text that I can engage with for meditation? And so, for example, as I've just thought of it there on the shelf, here's an example. It's called the Catholic Prayer Bible, the Lectio Divina edition, and it's designed specifically to provide a version of the NRSV which is presented in a way that particularly helps people who want to engage with the Bible using the Lectio Divina method for contemplative or reflective reading of Scripture. So like any other skilled workperson, any skilled worker, you go into the shed and you choose the tool which is most relevant to the task at hand. And that's true for Bibles as well. And then you may want to think about what other resources come either with the Bible or in related publications which are coming out from the same publisher. That'll be particularly important if you're looking at Bible software. Then there's the question of, what does my priest recommend? What does my minister recommend? We certainly don't have to follow the recommendations of our clergy, but if we take their spiritual leadership seriously, we're going to include their advice as we weigh up our own decisions about which versions of the Bible are going to be most suitable, most appropriate for us to have in our collection. And then finally, as I've already mentioned, these days, one of the questions is Bible software. Not only because of the text of the Bible, including being able to quickly see what Greek or Hebrew or Latin words might be in the background, but because the Bible software comes with dictionaries, with atlases, with commentaries, with all kinds of other assistance, lectionaries and lexicons and so on, to help us understand both the biblical text and also the biblical message. And of course, they're not the same thing. So these days, I rarely buy a commentary in a print version, but I do keep adding commentaries and dictionaries and other reference works to my own installation of the Accordance Bible software. So really, it's over to us at this point. We have some understanding of how we got the Bible, of the incredible process of 2,000 years and more, from the Dead Sea Scrolls right down to when we go into a bookshop to pick a Bible off the shelf. We have some sense of the, if you like, the family tree for the English Bible. We understand the differences between the Authorized Bible down through to the New Revised Standard Version, the Jerusalem Bible, the NIV, the English Standard Version, and so on. And then we're going to choose a version and an edition which is right for the use if you like, fit for purpose in terms of how we're going to use the scriptures. Ultimately, of course, there's no spiritual benefit in having a bookcase full of copies of the Bible from different translators and publications. There's no spiritual value in having a bookcase full of commentaries and Bible dictionaries. The spiritual value comes when we engage with the scriptures, when we read them in the company of other people, present today and people from the past, consulting their opinions, seeking their advice, how to make sense of that text, how to apply it to our own life. So the point of choosing the Bible that's right for me is not just to make a clever choice, but to select a spiritual resource, a version of the Bible which I'm actually going to use in my own faith and in my own spiritual practice. God bless.